So I was on the phone recently with a good friend of mine who's a licensed fiduciary here in Arizona. We've worked together for over a decade, and it got me thinking about how confusing fiduciaries, trustees, and personal representatives are for most families. So today I want to walk through some of the questions I get all the time, and I'll answer them with real stories from probate and trust administration. What is a licensed fiduciary and where do they show up in probate or trust? Most people don't realize licensed fiduciaries even exist. In probate and trust administration, a licensed fiduciary can serve as trustee, successor trustee, or a personal representative of an estate. They're licensed, regulated, and often brought in when families don't want the responsibility, or when they're a court that wants a neutral professional, or if there's a beneficiary with high needs, or like a minor or a person with mental disease, mental illness. They're a very real part of probate, not just planning. So licensed fiduciaries aren't just for trust, they show up in probate all the time. What's a great real world example where a fiduciary makes sense? So recently I had a case where a brother and sister came to see me. So their brother passed away and he left them as a successor trustee in their trust. The beneficiary of his trust was his wife, his surviving spouse, so their sister-in-law. Now, the surviving spouse was actually in assisted living. She lacked capacity and needed full-time care. And she actually moved out of Arizona to be closer to her child. So this is a perfect situation where it makes sense to turn over the responsibility and a liability to a professional, like a licensed fiduciary. So luckily, in this situation, there was enough money where they're able to hire a professional third party. Are licensed fiduciaries always available or willing to take a case? Well, no, unfortunately, they're not. And this may surprise people, but there's plenty of situations where a fiduciary wants to help, but they can't. Not because they don't care, but because the risk and liability outweigh what the trust or estate can support. Why does liability matter so much for fiduciaries in probate? In probate, fiduciaries and personal representatives are dealing with courts, deadlines, creditors, and beneficiaries, a lot of times all at once. Licensed fiduciaries are highly regulated and their fees are scrutinized. They can't charge flat fees or minimum fees like attorneys or trust companies. So if an estate is small but messy, the math just doesn't work. Some probate cases are just too risky for professionals to take on. Why do fiduciaries sometimes get a bad rap online? So this one always makes me laugh a little bit. So what you got to remember, a lot of times these fiduciary companies, they're dealing with the people that no one else is able to deal with. Now, sometimes it may be just a minor child, but a lot of times it's a person with, maybe it's a kid that mom and dad were taking care of their whole life, supporting, enabling. But once they pass away, there's no one willing to deal with this person. So these are the type of people that often go online and will leave one-star reviews. And this doesn't mean that the fiduciary isn't doing their job. A lot of times their job is to say no. It's to protect that beneficiary from themselves a lot of times. So that's why it can make it difficult when you're searching fiduciaries. For a lot of other businesses, it's good to go online and look at the reviews, but you got to realize what fiduciaries are dealing with and why they may have some negative reviews online. So when might you not want to use a licensed fiduciary? So my answer here may surprise a lot of people. After helping hundreds of families administer trusts and estates, I found that the most efficient option is often having a beneficiary serve as trustee or personal representative with legal guidance with someone like myself, especially when the family mostly gets along. I say mostly, a lot of times there's one or two kids or beneficiaries that they're worried may cause a problem. But as long as we do everything right, provide notice to them and we show them that we're following all the rules and doing a good job, I found that they're rarely an issue. So as long as the family mostly gets along, I think it's better to name one of the kids or one of the beneficiaries and have them hire someone like me to represent them as trustee or personal representative for the probate. Why is the beneficiary or family member often better as PR or trustee? Speed. An individual fiduciary can usually move much faster than a fiduciary company. They don't have the layers of legal counsel or institutional risk management slowing them down. And in probate, speed matters. Speed matters more in probate than people realize. Where do you see this difference most clearly? So I've seen this in distressed real estate and weird assets. So I've seen estates with hoarder houses, broken down rentals, and assets that are hard to value. An individual personal representative can talk to investors, get cash offers, and let the market determine the value. A licensed fiduciary often has to get appraisals, list with an agent, and document everything, which takes longer and often nets less money. What if beneficiaries actually get along? If beneficiaries are cooperative, a third-party fiduciary is often more expensive and more time-consuming than necessary. You're paying for protection that you don't necessarily need. So in those cases, simplicity usually wins. If the family gets along, keep it simple. Who is your favorite person to represent in probate or trust administration? Honestly, my favorite client is a personal representative or trustee who is not a beneficiary. They have the liability, but none of the personal financial upside. So we do a lot of their job for them, help them get compensated fairly, and keep everything clean. So to me, it's a no-brainer. If you're listed as the fiduciary, I don't know why you wouldn't hire the best counsel that you can. Can you share a real case where efficiency really mattered in probate? So I've helped individual trustees and personal representatives deal with distressed real estate where there was a squatter living in the property. In one case, the squatter was actually a family member who was also a beneficiary. Instead of going through a long eviction process, court hearings, emotional stress, we decided to sell the property as is to an investor willing to buy it as is and occupied. Why the discount was still a win. So yes, the property was sold at a discount, but if you look at the full picture, the legal fees avoided, the time saved, the emotional costs, it was absolutely the right move. And there was something else that really mattered. Once the property was sold, the eviction wasn't being done by a sibling or another beneficiary. It was being done by a stranger with proper notice, and that completely changed the family dynamic. So sometimes the best decision isn't the highest price, it's the cleanest exit. Have you seen similar issues with rental properties and trusts? Yes, I've seen issues like that. So one time we had a situation where successor trustee took over the trust after the person passed away, and there was a bunch of rental properties. The tenants didn't speak English, they all spoke Spanish, and we didn't know if they were actually had leases and if they were paying rent, but we couldn't figure out where it was going. So I was able to send a real estate professional out to knock on the doors and try to help us gather that information. But the person they told us they were sending the rent to wasn't very cooperative with us. So that was another situation where I turned to real estate investors who were able to buy the properties as is with people inside of them. So we were able to quickly liquidate those assets for the trust, quickly collect those assets for the trust and secure that. So I thought that was a great example of how if it was a fiduciary company, they wouldn't have been able to move that quickly and it would have taken them much longer to resolve that situation. Why wouldn't a licensed fiduciary handle those situations the same way? Well, they might, but it would almost certainly take much longer. So licensed fiduciaries have higher liability and stricter procedural requirements. Those cases could have easily taken a couple of years instead of a couple of months. So that difference matters when you're administering a trust or an estate. What happens when families insist on naming a third-party fiduciary? So I've seen several cases where beneficiaries insist on naming a third-party licensed fiduciary. Years later, those cases are still ongoing. And I know that because I'm still waiting to get paid. So like I often do, part of my fee agreement or part of my fees get paid once they're able to collect their share of the estate. I see how long some of these drag out when they turn it over to a licensed fiduciary company. How does real estate experience fit into probate and trust administration? Probate and trust administration often comes down to real estate. And over the years, I've built a network of trusted real estate partners, investors, agents, and professionals who understand probate situations. That network lets us solve problems quickly and ethically. Just like fiduciaries, there are great real estate professionals and there are bad actors who give the profession a bad name. Choosing the right one matters. So probate and real estate are deeply connected. What's the big takeaway for trustees and personal representatives? So big takeaway, licensed fiduciaries can be incredibly helpful in the right situations. Now, oftentimes, if the families or beneficiaries mostly get along, it can be better to name a personal beneficiary or an individual beneficiary as a trustee or personal representative and have them hire someone like me for legal help and someone that's connected to good real estate partners. If there's a beneficiary with high needs, like a beneficiary that needs ongoing care, in assisted living, person with mental illness, things like that, or sometimes minor kids, a lot of times minor kids, it's really good to have a third-party licensed fiduciary. All the other situations, it can be better to have an individual beneficiary. If you're a trustee or personal representative dealing with a trust or an estate, whether there's family conflict, real estate, or just uncertain about the next step, these are the exact situations that I help people with. Probate and trust administration doesn't have to drag on with the right team.